In the bitter winter of 1865, beneath the cobblestones of a forgotten Italian village, something stirred in the darkness. The locals whispered of screams that echoed from beneath the earth itself, muffled cries that seemed to rise from the very bowels of hell. They spoke of Sister Margherita, whose eyes had turned black as coal, whose prayers had become curses, and whose salvation had twisted into something far more sinister. What they discovered in that cursed convent would shake the foundations of faith itself and reveal a truth so dark that the Vatican would spend decades trying to bury it alongside the bodies. Tonight, I pull back the veil on one of history's most horrifying religious scandals, a tale of divine madness, underground chambers, and a woman whose devotion to God became an obsession with death. The screams you're about to hear echo through time itself, carrying with them the weight of souls who trusted the wrong shepherd. This is not just history. This is a warning about what happens when absolute power meets absolute corruption, when faith becomes fanaticism, and when salvation transforms into damnation. Now write in the comments which city and what time you are listening to us from, so we know who is absorbing this secret. Picture Italy in 1865, a nation bleeding from unification wars, where ancient traditions crumbled beneath the weight of modern ambition. The village of San Benedetto nestled in the shadow of the Alps, its narrow streets echoing with the footsteps of pilgrims seeking refuge from a world gone mad. Here, the Convent of Sacred Hearts stood as a beacon of hope, its stone walls weathered by centuries of prayer, its bells calling the faithful to salvation. The nuns within were daughters of noble families, women who had traded earthly pleasures for eternal promises. They tended gardens, copied manuscripts, and ministered to the poor with gentle hands and pure hearts. Yet something sinister had begun to fester within those holy walls. Visitors spoke of strange odors emanating from the convent grounds, not the sweet incense of worship, but something rotten, something that spoke of decay and desperation. Local children reported seeing shadows moving in the basement windows long after the sisters had retired to their chambers. The village priest, Father Giuseppe, grew pale whenever asked about the convent's activities, his hands trembling as he blessed himself repeatedly. What had begun as divine devotion was slowly metamorphosing into something far more dangerous, something that would challenge everything these simple people believed about good and evil. And if you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Sister Margherita di Santo had not always been a creature of darkness. Born Isabella Torriani to one of Milan's most respected banking families, she had possessed everything: beauty, intelligence, wealth, and a future bright with possibility. Yet at 17, after witnessing her younger brother's death from consumption, she had renounced her inheritance and entered the Convent of Sacred Hearts with a fervor that unsettled even the Mother Superior. Her devotion was absolute, her penances severe, her prayers lasting from dawn until midnight. She spoke of visions, Christ appearing to her in dreams, Mary weeping tears of blood, angels whispering secrets that only she could hear. The other sisters initially admired her dedication, but admiration slowly curdled into unease as Isabella's practices grew more extreme. She fasted until her ribs showed through her habit, spent nights kneeling on broken stones, and carved religious symbols into her flesh with rusty nails. When she was appointed Mother Superior at the unprecedented age of 23, some attributed it to divine intervention. Others whispered of darker influences at work. Margherita spoke constantly of purification, of the need to cleanse not just the soul, but the very flesh that housed it. She preached that suffering was the truest path to God, that pain was prayer made manifest, and that only through complete submission to agony could one achieve true salvation. Her sermons grew longer, stranger, filled with references to underground sanctuaries and hidden chambers where the faithful could commune directly with the divine. The changes began subtly, like poison seeping slowly through healthy veins. Sister Catherine was the first to vanish, her bed found empty one November morning with no explanation. Mother Margarita claimed she had been called to a higher service, that God had summoned her to prepare a special place of worship. When questioned by the local authorities, Margarita's answers were vague, mystical, speaking of spiritual journeys that transcended earthly understanding. Then Sister Agnes disappeared, followed by young novice Teresa, each vanishing, leaving behind only their folded habits and rosary beads arranged in perfect crosses upon their beds. The remaining nuns grew fearful, gathering in whispered clusters to share their growing dread. They spoke of strange sounds echoing from beneath the convent floors, scratching, crying, and what sounded like muffled prayers spoken in voices they recognized but could no longer reach. Mother Margarita's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would disappear for days at a time, emerging gaunt and wild-eyed, her hands stained with dirt and something darker. She preached of underground sanctuaries where the pure could await Christ's return, protected from the corruption of the surface world. Village merchants noted massive purchases of rope, candles, and oddly, shovels, tools that seemed incongruous with the contemplative life of the convent. The local doctor, summoned to treat what Margarita claimed were cases of religious ecstasy among her remaining sisters, found women in states of severe malnourishment and psychological distress, their eyes hollow with a fear they dared not voice. The truth erupted like a festering wound when young Giovanni, the baker's son, fell through a concealed trapdoor while delivering bread to the convent kitchen. His screams echoed through chambers that should not have existed, spaces carved from the living rock beneath the holy ground. What the rescue party discovered defied both reason and faith. An underground labyrinth of interconnected cells, each barely large enough for a human body, where 17 sisters and novices had been systematically buried alive. The horror was methodical, calculated with the precision of a master architect of suffering. Each cell contained the remains of a woman who had trusted her Mother Superior's promises of spiritual elevation. Margarita had convinced them that burial alive was the ultimate act of faith, a way to experience Christ's death and resurrection firsthand. She had sealed them in these earthen tombs with enough air to survive for days, telling them their suffering would purify not just themselves, but the entire world. Crude speaking tubes connected the cells, allowing Margarita to deliver what she called divine guidance to her buried sisters as they slowly suffocated in their earthen prisons. The walls bore scratches from desperate fingernails, and scattered throughout were religious artifacts, crucifixes, prayer books, and handwritten notes documenting the victims' final thoughts as they realized salvation would not come. The most chilling discovery was Margarita's journal, meticulously documenting each burial, each sister's final words, and her own twisted interpretation of their deaths as necessary sacrifices for the greater glory of God. The revelation shattered the village of San Benedetto like thunder splitting a peaceful sky. Within hours, crowds gathered outside the convent walls, their faces twisted with rage and disbelief. How had such monstrous evil taken root in holy ground? The surviving sisters, rescued from their underground prison, were traumatized beyond repair. Some never spoke again, others spent their remaining days rocking and whispering prayers that sounded more like curses. Margarita herself was found in the deepest chamber, having prepared her own burial cell complete with religious texts and enough supplies to last for weeks. She showed no remorse, claiming instead that she had been chosen by God to demonstrate the ultimate sacrifice, that her buried sisters were now saints in heaven interceding for humanity's salvation. The trial that followed became a sensation across Europe, with newspapers dubbing her the Devil's Nun and the Underground Mother. Theologians debated whether pure faith could be corrupted into such evil, while psychologists argued she represented a new form of religious madness. The Vatican, horrified by the scandal's impact on church authority, worked tirelessly to suppress details of the case. Key witnesses died mysteriously, documents disappeared, and within 5 years, most records had been sealed in archives that remain closed to this day. Margarita was declared legally insane and confined to a remote asylum, where she continued preaching to invisible congregations about the salvation found in earthen graves. The convent was demolished, its stones scattered, and the underground chambers filled with concrete and blessed soil. Yet the questions that arose from those cursed chambers continue to echo through time like the final prayers of the buried sisters. What transforms devotion into destruction? How does the promise of salvation become the guarantee of damnation? The case of Margarita de Santo forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of faith itself, that the very qualities we admire in religious devotion, when twisted by madness or megalomania, can become instruments of unthinkable horror. In that underground labyrinth, absolute faith met absolute power, and 17 innocent souls paid the price for one woman's twisted vision of divine will. The surviving records, those few that escaped Vatican censorship, reveal that Margarita never wavered in her conviction that she had acted righteously. Even in the asylum, even facing death, she maintained that her buried sisters had achieved a purity impossible for those who lived above ground. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that her actions were not random violence, but the logical conclusion of a belief system pushed to its absolute extreme. She had taken the fundamental Christian concepts of sacrifice, suffering, and submission to divine will and perverted them into justification for murder. Today, beneath the modern streets of what was once San Benedetto, those chambers remain sealed, their concrete caps occasionally cracking to release whispers of the past, reminders that evil often wears the mask of righteousness, and that the most dangerous monsters are those who believe themselves to be saviors. But this was never just about one mad nun and her twisted theology. What I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about religious institutions and their hidden agendas. The case of Sister Margarita was not an isolated incident of religious madness. It was part of a much larger pattern, a systematic program that the church hierarchy had been developing for centuries. Deep within the Vatican's secret archives lie documents that reveal a chilling truth. The underground burial rituals practiced by Margarita were based on ancient texts, forbidden scriptures that speak of achieving divine transcendence through controlled death experiences. These weren't the ravings of a madwoman. They were the careful implementation of esoteric Christian doctrines that trace back to the earliest days of the Church. The practice, known in secret Vatican circles as sepulchrum vivum, the living tomb, was allegedly used to create mystic saints, individuals who could communicate directly with the divine through near-death experiences. What happened in San Benedetto was the corruption of this ancient ritual, twisted by Margarita's psychological instability into actual murder. But here's where the conspiracy deepens. Church records show that at least 7 other convents across Europe had been experimenting with similar practices during the same period. The Vatican knew. They watched, they documented, and when things went wrong, they covered it up with the same ruthless efficiency they had perfected over millennia of protecting their secrets. The surviving sisters from these experiments were either silenced permanently or confined to remote asylums where their testimonies could never threaten church authority. The roots of this horror stretch back to the early Christian mystical traditions, to secret societies within the church that believed salvation required more than prayer and penance. It demanded the complete dissolution of earthly attachment through controlled trauma. These inner circles, known as the Custodes Mortis, the guardians of death, preserved ancient rituals that the mainstream church had officially condemned but privately studied. They believed that certain individuals, when subjected to extreme psychological and physical stress, could achieve direct communication with the divine realm. The buried sisters of San Benedetto were not random victims. They were carefully selected based on psychological profiles developed by church scholars who had spent decades studying the relationship between trauma and religious ecstasy. Margarita herself was likely identified years before her appointment as Mother Superior. Her psychological instability not seen as a weakness, but as a necessary tool for implementing these forbidden practices. The Vatican archives contain her correspondence with high-ranking church officials, letters that reveal a disturbing level of institutional support for her spiritual experiments. When church investigators finally arrived at San Benedetto, they came not to stop the atrocities, but to study the results. They meticulously documented the psychological states of the buried sisters, the duration of their survival, and their final words, treating human suffering as raw data in their quest to understand the boundaries between life and death, between sanity and divine madness. This knowledge was then compiled into secret manuals that were distributed to select monasteries and convents across Europe, creating a network of experimental sites where the Church could continue its research into controlled death experiences. The Church's selection criteria for these experiments reveal a level of calculated cruelty that defies comprehension. They sought young women from wealthy families, not for their money, but because trauma inflicted upon the privileged would generate more intense psychological responses. These candidates were identified through an extensive screening process that evaluated their susceptibility to religious suggestion, their family histories of mental instability, and their capacity for absolute obedience. Margarita herself fit the profile perfectly, intelligent enough to understand the theological justifications for her actions, psychologically fragile enough to be manipulated, and charismatic enough to influence others. The Church documents reveal that she underwent months of preparatory conditioning before being appointed Mother Superior, sessions conducted by Church psychologists who used a combination of religious indoctrination and psychological manipulation to prepare her for her role as executioner. The sisters selected for burial were also chosen according to specific criteria. The Church wanted subjects who were deeply devout but also possessed certain psychological vulnerabilities that would make them susceptible to extreme religious experiences. They were gradually conditioned through a process of escalating spiritual exercises, extended fasting, sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, designed to break down their psychological defenses and make them more receptive to Margarita's ultimate suggestions. The surviving records show that this conditioning process could take months or even years, with Church observers monitoring each subject's progress and adjusting the psychological pressure accordingly. By the time these women were led to their underground chambers, their capacity for rational thought had been so thoroughly compromised that they genuinely believed their burial alive would result in spiritual elevation rather than death. The design of the underground burial chambers was not the product of Margarita's madness. It was based on architectural plans that had been developed and refined by Church engineers over decades of experimentation. These chambers were designed with scientific precision to maximize psychological impact while maintaining the subject's survival for predetermined periods. Each cell was exactly 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet deep, dimensions calculated to create maximum claustrophobia while allowing for the physical positioning necessary for the ritual prayers that subjects were required to perform during their burial. The speaking tubes that connected the chambers were positioned at specific angles to create acoustic effects that would enhance the psychological experience of hearing other buried victims' prayers and cries. The air circulation system was designed to provide just enough oxygen to sustain life for several days, allowing subjects to experience the gradual approach of death while maintaining consciousness long enough to document their psychological transformation. Church engineers had even calculated the optimal soil composition for the covering, dense enough to create the sensation of being trapped, but porous enough to allow limited airflow. The chambers included hidden observation panels that allowed Church researchers to monitor subjects without their knowledge, documenting their physical and psychological deterioration for scientific purposes. These observations were compiled into detailed reports that were sent directly to the Vatican, where they were analyzed by Church scholars who used this data to refine their understanding of the relationship between extreme trauma and religious experience. The underground complex at San Benedetto was actually a prototype for similar facilities that were being constructed at monasteries and convents across Catholic Europe. The method by which the Church transformed innocent young women into willing participants in their own deaths reveals a level of psychological manipulation that predates modern brainwashing techniques by centuries. The process began with what church documents called spiritual preparation, a gradual escalation of religious practices designed to separate subjects from rational thought and social support systems. Sisters selected for the program were assigned to special prayer groups where they would spend increasing amounts of time in meditation, fasting, and scriptural study, focused specifically on passages about martyrdom and sacrifice. They were gradually isolated from other sisters who were not part of the program, creating an echo chamber where only approved thoughts and interpretations were permitted. The conditioning process included systematic sleep deprivation disguised as extended prayer vigils, nutritional manipulation presented as spiritual fasting, and sensory deprivation exercises framed as mystical experiences. Subject sisters were encouraged to report their dreams and visions, which were then interpreted by Margarita and her handlers as divine communications calling for greater sacrifice. Those who showed resistance to the conditioning were either removed from the program or subjected to more intensive psychological pressure until their defenses crumbled. The church documents reveal that this conditioning process had been developed through decades of experimentation on unwilling subjects, with the techniques refined based on careful observation of what methods most effectively broke down psychological resistance. By the time subjects were led to their burial chambers, their sense of self had been so thoroughly eroded that they genuinely believed death by suffocation was God's will for their lives. What makes the San Benedetto atrocity truly terrifying is not just the scale of the individual crime, but the revelation of how many people had to remain silent for it to succeed. The network of complicity extended far beyond the convent walls, reaching into the highest levels of church hierarchy and secular authority. Local officials who should have investigated the disappearances were paid to look the other way, their silence purchased with church gold and threats of excommunication. The village doctor who examined the malnourished sisters was actually a church operative, trained in psychological manipulation and tasked with ensuring that subjects remained physically capable of participating in their own deaths. Even the families of the victims were complicit, their grief and questions silenced by church representatives who convinced them that their daughters' disappearances were evidence of divine calling rather than human crime. The conspiracy required the cooperation of dozens of individuals, from church architects who designed the chambers to grave diggers who helped excavate them, from Vatican officials who approved the funding to local priests who provided theological justification for the atrocities. Each participant was told only what they needed to know to perform their role, creating a compartmentalized system that made it almost impossible for any individual to fully understand the scope of the operation. The Church had perfected a system of distributed responsibility that allowed massive crimes to be committed while maintaining plausible deniability at every level of the hierarchy. This network of complicity was not unique to San Benedetto. It was a template that had been successfully implemented at experimental sites across Europe, each one protected by the same web of silence and shared guilt that made exposure nearly impossible. The most chilling aspect of the San Benedetto experiments was their methodical, scientific approach to human suffering. Church researchers treated the buried sisters not as individual human beings, but as experimental subjects in a vast study of consciousness, death, and religious experience. Each burial was carefully documented, with observers recording the exact time subjects were sealed in their chambers, their vital signs during the initial burial process, and their psychological responses to the experience of living entombment. The speaking tubes that connected the chambers served a dual purpose. They allowed subjects to maintain the illusion of communication and support, while providing researchers with clear audio recordings of the victim's psychological deterioration. These recordings were transcribed by church scribes and analyzed by theologians and early psychologists who were attempting to map the relationship between extreme trauma and mystical experience. The research methodology included control groups. Some sisters were buried for predetermined periods and then rescued, allowing researchers to study the long-term psychological effects of near-death experiences. Others were left to die completely, providing data on the final stages of consciousness during suffocation. The duration of each burial was carefully calculated based on the subject's physical condition, psychological profile, and the specific research questions that church scientists were attempting to answer. The results of these experiments were compiled into extensive reports that were circulated among a select group of church intellectuals who used this data to develop new theories about the nature of the soul, the process of death, and the possibility of achieving direct communication with the divine through controlled trauma. This scientific approach to murder reveals how easily academic curiosity can be perverted into a justification for unthinkable cruelty. Deep within the Vatican archives lie detailed psychological profiles of each victim, compiled by church researchers who studied their subjects with the cold precision of modern criminal psychologists. These profiles reveal how carefully the church selected women whose psychological makeup made them ideal candidates for manipulation and ultimate destruction. Sister Catherine, the first to disappear, was chosen specifically because of her history of religious visions and her documented struggle with what modern psychology would recognize as severe anxiety disorder. Her profile notes that she was highly suggestible under religious authority and possessed an abnormal capacity for self-denial. Sister Agnes was selected for her family history of mystical experiences. Her grandmother had reportedly experienced divine visions, making her a valuable subject for studying hereditary predispositions to religious ecstasy. The profiles document each woman's fears, desires, family relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities, creating detailed psychological maps that allowed Margarita and her handlers to target their manipulation with surgical precision. The church researchers were particularly interested in studying how different personality types responded to the burial experience. Some subjects were chosen for their natural submissiveness, others for their leadership qualities, still others for their documented history of rebellious behavior. Each psychological profile was paired with detailed predictions about how the subject would respond to various stages of the conditioning process and the burial experience itself. These predictions were tested against actual outcomes, with researchers noting discrepancies and adjusting their theories accordingly. The clinical detachment with which these profiles were compiled reveals how completely the church had dehumanized their victims, reducing complex human beings to collections of psychological data points to be manipulated and ultimately destroyed in service of their twisted research agenda. At the halfway point of this journey into darkness, I must ask you to demonstrate your commitment to this forbidden knowledge. Write these words twice in the comments. Truth buried deep. Let this phrase be your acknowledgement that you have crossed the threshold from ignorance to dangerous awareness, and let the algorithm know that you are ready for the complete revelation. The theological justification for the San Benedetto atrocities was not invented by Margarita's madness. It was drawn from ancient Christian texts that the Church had officially condemned while secretly preserving for centuries. These forbidden manuscripts, known collectively as the Codex Mortis, contained detailed instructions for achieving direct communication with the divine through controlled death experiences. Originally written by early Christian mystics who believed that the boundary between life and death was merely an illusion preventing true spiritual enlightenment, these texts had been declared heretical by church councils, but remained hidden in Vatican archives, where they continued to influence select theologians and researchers. The Codex described death not as an end, but as a transition that could be temporarily experienced and reversed, allowing practitioners to gain divine knowledge unavailable to the living. Margarita's conditioning had included extensive study of these forbidden texts, with church scholars interpreting the ancient Greek and Latin passages to provide theological justification for what was essentially ritualized murder. The texts spoke of sacred sepulture as a path to mystical union with Christ, describing elaborate rituals involving burial, prayer, and eventual resurrection that bore disturbing similarities to what happened in the chambers beneath San Benedetto. These manuscripts had influenced centuries of secret church practices, from medieval flagellant movements to Renaissance experiments in induced mystical states, Each generation of church researchers adding their own interpretations and methodologies to the ancient foundation of controlled death experiences. When news of the San Benedetto discoveries began to spread, the Vatican initiated one of the most comprehensive cover-up operations in church history, demonstrating their centuries of experience in concealing institutional crimes. Within hours of the first newspaper reports, church operatives were dispatched to every major European city to purchase and destroy copies of publications containing details about the underground chambers. Key witnesses began disappearing with alarming frequency. Some died in apparent accidents, others simply vanished without explanation. Still others were committed to remote asylums where their testimonies could be dismissed as the ravings of madmen. The Church deployed its vast network of political influence to pressure government officials into suppressing official investigations, using a combination of bribery, blackmail, and threats of religious sanctions to ensure cooperation. Surviving documents were systematically removed from public archives, with church agents posing as scholars and researchers to gain access to files that were then stolen or destroyed. The few journalists who attempted to investigate the story further found themselves facing sudden financial ruin, social ostracism, or mysterious illnesses that forced them to abandon their inquiries. The Church even went so far as to create false historical records that contradicted survivor testimonies, planting fabricated documents in various archives to create confusion about what had actually occurred at San Benedetto. Local residents who had witnessed the excavation of the chambers were relocated to distant parishes with new identities and church-provided employment, their silence purchased with promises of financial security for their families. The cover-up operation extended to the medical and academic communities, with church-affiliated doctors and scholars publishing papers that dismissed the San Benedetto discoveries as elaborate hoaxes perpetrated by anti-Catholic propagandists. Of the 6 sisters who survived the underground chambers, only one ever broke her silence about the horrors she had witnessed, and her testimony reveals psychological manipulation techniques that wouldn't be formally recognized by psychology for another century. Sister Lucia, who had been rescued after 3 days of burial, spent years in church-controlled psychiatric facilities before finally escaping to provide testimony that was immediately suppressed by Vatican authorities. Her account describes systematic conditioning that began months before the actual burials, with Margarita and other church operatives using a combination of sensory manipulation, nutritional control, and religious indoctrination to break down their victims' psychological defenses. According to Lucia, the conditioning process included exposure to what she described as artificial visions, carefully orchestrated experiences involving drugs, theatrical effects, and psychological suggestion designed to make the subjects believe they were receiving direct communications from divine sources. These fake mystical experiences were used to gradually introduce the concept of burial alive as a sacred ritual, with each sister being told that she had been specially chosen by God for this ultimate test of faith. Lucia's testimony reveals that many of the sisters actually requested to be buried, genuinely believing that their suffocation would result in spiritual transcendence and eventual resurrection. Her account includes horrifying details about the final moments of her fellow sisters, their desperate prayers gradually becoming screams of terror as they realized that salvation would not come, that their faith had been perverted into the instrument of their destruction. Most disturbing of all, Lucia testified that Margarita would visit the burial chambers regularly, speaking to the dying women through the communication tubes and encouraging them to embrace their suffering as evidence of divine love. Lucia's testimony was eventually sealed in church archives, but not before she managed to share her story with underground networks of former clergy who were working to expose church corruption. The horrifying truth is that San Benedetto was not an isolated incident, but part of an international network of experimental sites where the Church was conducting similar research into the relationship between trauma and religious experience. Scattered references in diplomatic correspondence and private letters reveal that parallel experiments were being conducted at monasteries and convents across Catholic Europe. Each site adapting the basic methodology to their specific circumstances and research objectives. A Benedictine monastery in Bavaria was experimenting with prolonged sensory deprivation, keeping subjects in complete darkness and silence for months at a time while monitoring their psychological deterioration. A convent in France was studying the effects of controlled starvation on religious visions, systematically starving selected nuns while documenting their reported mystical experiences. In Spain, church researchers were investigating the relationship between physical torture and claims of divine communication, subjecting volunteer monastics to carefully calibrated levels of pain while recording their spiritual responses. These experiments were coordinated through a secret Vatican office known as the Congregatio pro Investigatione Mystica, the Congregation for Mystical Investigation, which served as a clearinghouse for research data and methodological innovations developed at various experimental sites. Regular conferences were held in remote locations where church researchers would share their findings and coordinate future experiments, treating human suffering as raw material for advancing their understanding of mystical phenomena. The international scope of these operations required massive financial resources and political protection, indicating that the Church's investment in this research represented a major institutional priority rather than the actions of isolated fanatics. Evidence suggests that similar experimental networks operated in the Americas and Asia, wherever Catholic missions had established sufficient institutional control to conduct their research without outside interference. The long-term psychological effects on survivors of these experiments reveal the true scope of the Church's crimes against human consciousness itself. Medical records from the few survivors who escaped church custody describe symptoms that wouldn't be formally recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder for another century. Chronic nightmares, flashbacks, dissociative episodes, and complete loss of faith, not just in religious institutions, but in the fundamental benevolence of human nature. Sister Lucia's medical files document her struggle with what doctors described as religious terror syndrome, an inability to hear church bells, see crucifixes, or encounter any religious imagery without experiencing severe panic attacks and psychological regression. Her testimony describes recurring dreams in which she relived not just her own burial experience, but also the deaths of her fellow sisters, their final screams echoing through her consciousness decades after their actual deaths. Other survivors exhibited what medical observers termed temporal displacement, a psychological condition in which they continued to believe they were still buried alive, creating elaborate fantasy scenarios to explain their apparent rescue, while remaining convinced that their underground imprisonment was ongoing. The Church's psychological manipulation had been so thorough that some survivors were never able to distinguish between their actual experiences and the artificial visions that had been used to condition them for burial. They lived in a state of permanent uncertainty about the nature of reality itself, their trust in their own perceptions shattered by months of systematic deception and manipulation. Even more disturbing, several survivors exhibited symptoms of what modern psychology would recognize as identification with their abusers, continuing to defend Margarita's actions and insisting that their burial experience had been spiritually beneficial despite the obvious trauma it had caused. These psychological profiles were carefully documented by church researchers who used this data to refine their conditioning techniques for future experiments. The San Benedetto experiments forced theologians to confront fundamental questions about the nature of religious experience and the relationship between faith and psychological manipulation that the Church had been avoiding for centuries. If genuine mystical experiences could be artificially induced through trauma, drugs, and psychological conditioning, what did this reveal about the authenticity of the spiritual encounters that formed the foundation of Christian theology? Church scholars who had access to the experimental data were forced to consider the disturbing possibility that many of the mystical experiences recorded throughout Christian history, from the visions of medieval saints to the ecstatic experiences of contemporary mystics, might have been the result of psychological manipulation rather than divine intervention. The research data from San Benedetto and similar experiments suggested that extreme psychological pressure could reliably produce reports of divine communication, religious visions, and claims of spiritual transcendence that were indistinguishable from those found in official church records of genuine saints and mystics. This raised profound questions about the Church's ability to distinguish between authentic spiritual experiences and artificially induced psychological phenomena. Some theologians argued that the experiments actually validated the reality of mystical experience by demonstrating that divine communication was accessible through controlled methods, while others concluded that the ease with which false visions could be produced called into question the entire foundation of Christian mysticism. The theological implications extended beyond abstract philosophical concerns to practical questions about church authority and the validation of religious experience. If church officials could artificially induce the same types of visions and spiritual experiences that they use to justify their authority and validate their doctrines, what did this reveal about the authenticity of the religious system they claimed to represent? The experimental data suggested that religious experience might be more psychological than divine, more manipulable than authentic, more human than celestial. The timing of the San Benedetto experiments was not coincidental. They occurred during a period when the Catholic Church was facing unprecedented challenges to its political and spiritual authority from emerging secular governments and scientific rationalism. The Church's investment in research into consciousness manipulation represented a desperate attempt to develop new methods of maintaining social control in an increasingly skeptical world. Church documents reveal that the experimental program was conceived as a response to what Vatican strategists called the crisis of faith, brought on by scientific advances and political liberation movements that were undermining traditional sources of church authority. By developing techniques that could reliably produce mystical experiences and religious conviction, church researchers hoped to create new methods of population control that would be more effective than traditional forms of religious indoctrination. The experiments were designed to test whether induced religious experiences could be used to create populations of fanatically devoted believers who would be immune to secular influences and willing to sacrifice their lives for church objectives. This research had obvious applications for missionary work in hostile territories, where church agents could potentially use psychological manipulation techniques to rapidly convert indigenous populations and create loyal followers who would support church interests against local political authorities. The political implications extended to Europe itself, where church researchers envisioned using their consciousness manipulation techniques to create networks of fanatically devoted believers who could serve as political operatives, intelligence agents, and, if necessary, religious terrorists willing to die for church objectives. The San Benedetto experiments were essentially research into developing human beings as programmable weapons in the Church's ongoing war against secular authority and rational thought. What the Church researchers discovered through their horrific experiments inadvertently contributed to advances in psychology and neuroscience that would eventually undermine the very religious authority they were trying to protect. The detailed documentation of psychological conditioning, trauma responses, and consciousness manipulation techniques developed through experiments like San Benedetto provided early insights into the workings of human psychology that wouldn't be formally recognized by academic science for decades. Church scholars who analyzed the experimental data began to understand that human consciousness was far more malleable than traditional theology suggested, that beliefs and perceptions could be systematically altered through environmental manipulation, and that what people experienced as divine revelation might actually be the product of measurably psychological processes. This knowledge was initially treated as a closely guarded secret that could be used to enhance church power, but it inevitably began to influence the thinking of church intellectuals who were exposed to the research data. Some of these scholars eventually left the church and contributed their insights to emerging scientific disciplines, carrying with them knowledge derived from human experimentation that helped advance understanding of psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience. The irony is profound. The Church's attempts to develop new methods of religious control through scientific research ultimately contributed to the scientific revolution that would demolish traditional religious explanations of human consciousness and behavior. The techniques developed through experiments like San Benedetto would eventually be recognized by secular psychology as methods of brainwashing, thought control, and psychological manipulation that revealed the artificial nature of many religious experiences. The Church's own research into consciousness manipulation became evidence against the authenticity of religious phenomena, demonstrating that what believers experienced as divine communication could be reliably produced through human intervention, using techniques that were entirely psychological rather than spiritual. The techniques developed through the San Benedetto experiments and similar Church research programs did not disappear with the official termination of the experimental programs. They evolved and found new applications in modern institutions that continue to use refined versions of these psychological manipulation methods. The systematic conditioning techniques that were used to prepare victims for burial alive became the foundation for modern methods of thought control, brainwashing, and psychological manipulation that are still employed by religious cults, political organizations, and intelligence agencies. The Vatican secret archives contain thousands of documents related to experimental programs like San Benedetto, sealed away from public scrutiny, but still accessible to researchers who possess the proper credentials and connections. These archives reveal that the Church's interest in consciousness manipulation and psychological control extends far beyond the isolated incidents that have been publicly exposed, encompassing centuries of systematic research into methods of breaking down individual will and creating programmable human beings. The archival documents describe ongoing research programs that continued well into the 20th century, adapted to modern conditions but still based on the fundamental insights gained through historical experiments like those conducted at San Benedetto. Modern Church documents use clinical language to describe what are essentially torture programs, referring to spiritual conditioning, mystical preparation, and transcendence therapy as euphemisms for psychological manipulation techniques that would be recognized as war crimes if employed by secular governments. The archives contain detailed psychological profiles of hundreds of victims from various experimental programs, compiled by Church researchers who treated human suffering as raw material for advancing their understanding of consciousness control. These profiles reveal a pattern of systematic targeting that focused on individuals whose psychological vulnerabilities made them ideal subjects for manipulation and ultimate destruction. The most chilling aspect of these archival documents is their clinical detachment, their reduction of human beings to experimental variables, their transformation of torture into research methodology. The archives also contain correspondence between Church researchers and secular scientists, indicating ongoing collaboration between religious and academic institutions in developing new methods of psychological manipulation and control. These documents suggest that the knowledge gained through Church experimentation has been shared with government agencies, intelligence organizations, and academic researchers who continue to build upon the foundation. The research conducted through programs like San Benedetto led to the development of what can only be described as psychological weapons, systematic methods of destroying human consciousness and replacing it with artificial constructs that serve institutional rather than individual interests. These weapons operate through the same basic principles that were refined in those underground chambers: isolation from normal social support systems, systematic undermining of individual judgment and perception, and gradual replacement of personal identity with institutional programming. The techniques are subtle, often appearing as beneficial spiritual or therapeutic practices, but their ultimate effect is the complete subjugation of individual will to external authority. Modern applications of these psychological weapons can be observed in various institutional contexts, from religious organizations that use systematic conditioning to create devoted followers willing to sacrifice their lives and resources for church objectives to corporate training programs that break down individual resistance and create compliant employees who identify completely with company goals. The most sophisticated applications involve what researchers call voluntary victimization, conditioning techniques that lead individuals to actively seek out situations where they will be psychologically manipulated and controlled, genuinely believing that their submission represents spiritual growth or personal development. These psychological weapons are particularly effective because they exploit fundamental human needs for meaning, community, and transcendence, perverting these natural desires into mechanisms of control and manipulation. The victims often become enthusiastic advocates for their own continued manipulation, defending the institutions and individuals who are systematically destroying their capacity for independent thought and action. The development of these psychological weapons represents perhaps the most insidious legacy of the Church's experimental programs, demonstrating how human suffering can be systematically studied and weaponized for institutional advantage. The networks established through centuries of Church experimentation in consciousness manipulation continue to operate today, although they have adapted their methods to contemporary conditions and expanded their influence far beyond traditional religious institutions. These networks include former Church officials who have transferred their knowledge to secular organizations, academic researchers who have built their careers on insights derived from human experimentation, and institutional leaders who understand the practical applications of psychological manipulation techniques for maintaining power and control. The modern networks operate through a complex web of connections that includes religious organizations, academic institutions, government agencies, intelligence services, corporate training programs, and therapeutic communities that use refined versions of the conditioning techniques originally developed through programs like San Benedetto. These networks share information, coordinate research, and collaborate on developing new applications for consciousness manipulation technology, treating human psychology as a resource to be exploited rather than an aspect of human dignity to be respected. The networks maintain their secrecy through the same compartmentalization techniques that protected the original Church programs, ensuring that individual participants understand only their specific role while remaining ignorant of the larger system they serve. Modern network members often genuinely believe they are engaged in beneficial work, their perception of their activities shaped by the same psychological conditioning techniques that they employ on their subjects. The networks recruit new members through careful screening processes that identify individuals whose psychological profiles make them suitable for either manipulation or participation in manipulating others. The most disturbing aspect of these modern networks is their integration into mainstream institutions. Their ability to conduct psychological manipulation research and applications while maintaining respectable public facades. They have successfully embedded consciousness control techniques into educational systems, therapeutic practices, spiritual programs, and corporate training methods, ensuring that their influence extends throughout society while remaining largely invisible to public scrutiny. The experimental programs that began with institutions like San Benedetto never truly ended. They evolved, became more sophisticated, and found new venues for conducting research into consciousness manipulation and psychological control. Modern experimental programs operate under various cover stories, from academic research into religious experience, to therapeutic programs designed to treat psychological disorders, but their fundamental objectives remain unchanged, developing methods of breaking down individual will and creating programmable human consciousness. These modern experiments benefit from advances in neuroscience, pharmacology, and technology that allow researchers to manipulate consciousness with precision that would have been impossible for earlier generations of Church experimenters. Contemporary programs can use drug combinations, electronic devices, and environmental controls to induce specific psychological states and measure the results with scientific accuracy that far exceeds what was possible in historical experimental sites. The subjects of modern experiments often volunteer for programs that are presented as beneficial therapeutic or spiritual interventions, genuinely believing they are participating in activities designed to enhance their well-being rather than destroy their capacity for independent thought. Modern experimental programs operate in various institutional contexts, from university research departments, conducting studies on religious experience and altered consciousness, to therapeutic communities offering intensive spiritual retreats and consciousness exploration programs. The techniques used in these modern experiments are often identical to those developed through historical programs like San Benedetto, but they are presented using contemporary psychological and spiritual terminology that obscures their true nature and objectives. Participants in modern experimental programs report experiences that are remarkably similar to those described in historical church documents: artificial visions, induced mystical states, systematic breakdown of individual identity, and gradual replacement of personal will with institutional programming. The most chilling aspect of these modern experiments is their integration into mainstream therapeutic and spiritual communities, their ability to conduct systematic psychological manipulation while maintaining the appearance of beneficial intervention. The ultimate truth revealed through the San Benedetto case and centuries of similar church experimentation is that human consciousness itself has been weaponized by institutions that understand the malleable nature of belief, perception, and identity. What we experience as individual thoughts, personal beliefs, and authentic spiritual experiences may actually be the products of systematic conditioning and manipulation that begins in childhood and continues throughout our lives through various institutional channels. The techniques developed through programs like San Benedetto have become so pervasive and sophisticated that most people are completely unaware of the extent to which their consciousness has been shaped by external forces rather than emerging from authentic personal development. The institutions that possess this knowledge, religious organizations, government agencies, intelligence services, academic institutions, and corporate entities, use their understanding of consciousness manipulation to maintain systems of control that benefit their objectives, while convincing their subjects that they are acting according to their own free will and authentic beliefs. The most disturbing implication of this ultimate truth is the possibility that authentic human consciousness, free from institutional manipulation and conditioning, may be extremely rare in modern society. Most people may be living their entire lives as programmed entities, following scripts written by institutions that understand how to exploit fundamental human needs for meaning, community, and transcendence. The knowledge gained through centuries of systematic human experimentation has created a world where genuine freedom of thought and authentic spiritual experience have been replaced by sophisticated forms of psychological slavery that are invisible to their victims. Those who begin to recognize the extent of their own conditioning and manipulation face the terrifying prospect of reconstructing their entire understanding of reality, questioning not just their beliefs and perceptions, but their very sense of personal identity and individual agency. The ultimate truth is that the underground chambers of San Benedetto were not historical anomalies, but prototypes for the psychological prisons in which most of modern humanity unconsciously resides. You have descended into the deepest chambers of forbidden knowledge, witnessed the systematic destruction of human consciousness, and understood the techniques that continue to shape your own thoughts and beliefs. The question that now confronts you is the same one that faced every person who has ever glimpsed behind the veil of institutional deception. Will you retreat into comfortable ignorance, or will you accept the terrifying responsibility of authentic consciousness? The knowledge you have gained cannot be unlearned. The awareness you have developed cannot be reversed. The recognition of your own conditioning cannot be denied. You now understand that most of what you have believed about reality, spirituality, and human nature has been shaped by institutions that view your consciousness as raw material to be exploited, rather than an expression of human dignity to be respected. This recognition brings with it a profound loneliness. the isolation of seeing clearly while surrounded by those who remain trapped in systems of illusion and manipulation. Yet it also brings the possibility of authentic freedom, the chance to begin the difficult process of reconstructing your understanding of yourself and reality based on direct experience rather than institutional programming. The choice before you is not between good and evil, truth and falsehood, light and darkness. It is between the comfort of unconscious slavery and the terror of conscious freedom. Those who choose freedom must be prepared to question everything, to reconstruct their entire worldview, to face the possibility that nothing they have believed about themselves or reality is authentic. They must be prepared to live without the psychological support systems that institutions provide to keep their subjects compliant and dependent. Most importantly, they must be prepared to accept responsibility for their own consciousness and the choices that emerge from genuine self-awareness rather than programmed responses. The screams that echo from those underground chambers are not just the voices of historical victims. They are the cries of your own authentic self, buried alive beneath layers of conditioning and manipulation, waiting for you to excavate the truth of who you really are beneath everything you have been programmed to believe.